Hi everybody. This video is about animation. We're going to get started with our animation today. This is going to be a little more abbreviated version of what we talked about in class, just to kind of review the highlights. So the first place to start with your animation, as we discussed in class, is to thumbnail out your actions. Whatever action your character, your object is going to go through, you need to do a series of thumbnail drawings so that you know where you want to go, so that you can work out options on paper before you sit down and start playing with your character. So I'm not going to show you those because I have them, but we talked about it in class. Thumbnail out your work. It's so much faster to work on paper than it is to try and pose this guy and work out your poses directly in Maya. It takes far less time to do it on paper. So this guy is, his name is Goon. He's a pre-rigged character that you can find online. I'm going to use him as the demonstration today, simply because he's a pretty good rig, really good actually, and I can work with him pretty quickly. So the first step in doing any animation is to do your pop through, and a pop through is essentially a pose test. You're putting in the main poses for your scene so that you can make sure that all those poses work well together. So what I'm going to do here is just 2 or 3 quick poses. I'm not going to use all the controls you see here on the character. We want to get just the basics into place. What I'm going to do is Goon is just going to be standing there. Then he'll check his watch and he'll look up as though he's looking for the bus coming. So he's in his T-pose. The first thing we need to do is any control that we're going to use throughout the animation, we're going to have to set a key on frame 1, right down here. We want to make sure we're on frame 1, and we're going to set a key for any control we're going to use at any point during the animation. So probably the easiest way to do that with Goon here is just to highlight him entirely, which will select all of his controls, and hit S to key them, and we're ready to go. That sets all of our controls. The reason we want to do that is because if we set a control later in the timeline and we haven't set one in frame 1, that becomes the default pose for the entire sequence up to that key. So sometimes a control get used later in a sequence that isn't used earlier, and that positioning of that control goes back in time because that's the very first information Maya has about it. So it sometimes confuses folks. So let's go ahead and pose this guy. I'm going to take his feet here, and I'm just going to rotate his foot a little bit, and I'm going to move it out to the side. I'm just going to give him a little bit more interesting pose than just having his feet right next to each other. We'll give his pose a little bit of personality. So we'll slide those out. I'm going to grab this middle right here, and we're going to bend his knees a little bit because nobody stands with their legs really stiff. Not bad. And then what I'm going to do, I have my auto keying on right down here. This will set a key for any value that I change as soon as that control changes value. But it's not a bad idea to go ahead and just hit S anyway, because the auto key is only setting a new key for the values that change. So for example, when I moved him down, it set a value for the Y control, but not for the X or the Z, because those values didn't change. So if I change that later on, then we get back to the same problem we had before of that value perpetrating backwards along the timeline. I'm going to take all of his spine controls here. I'm just going to shift select these right up here like this, and I'm going to rotate him over just a tiny bit just to give him a little bit of a bend, and we'll take his head and we'll rotate that down just a little bit, and I'm going to take his we'll take his pelvis And we'll rotate that a little bit just to make that pose a little more interesting. And then we're going to take his arms and we're going to bring them down to the side. And we'll set a key on that. And I'm going to bend his elbow a little bit and set a key on that. And then I'm also going to turn his wrist a little bit, set a key. The other thing I like to do is on the fingers, I like to give them a little bit of a curve because nobody stands with their fingers straight out. So I'm going to take my index, base, mid, and tip, and I'm just going to bend that a little bit, and you can see that it's automatically keyed. And I'm going to take middle, base, and tip, give a little bit to that, ring, base, mid, tip, a little bit there, and then we'll take thumb, base, mid, tip, and we'll do that a little bit. And those are all automatically keying, so you can see here that the, oh, I forgot his pinky. Sorry about that. Base, little, mid, tip. So we now have a little more natural sort of position for his hand. I'll bring that back just a little bit. And we'll do the same thing with this arm. Bring this down, and bring it back a little, and bring it down just a little bit more. We want to avoid twinning. Twinning is where the arms and the legs are doing exactly the same thing at exactly the same time. So we want to break that up just a little bit. So what I'll do to fix that is I'll bring that hand around a little bit and maybe, well, maybe not. Yeah, that'll be good. What I'm going to do is I'm going to bring this wrist on his right hand in more like that. And then we'll get the back of the hand here, and again we'll do his finger controls. And these are finger controls that are built into the channel box. On your much simpler rig, these controls will be in your shelf. You will have, I hope that you've created buttons on your shelf to control these things. And we'll bring that in. So there's our first pose. We might even take this and move him back just a little bit, just to get him centered over his base of support. Now his mass is over his base of support. And there's our first pose. There's our first one. All right, what I want to do, I should have done this earlier, but I'll do it now, is I'm going to create a camera, just a regular camera. And we see it appear down there. And I'm going to come up here into panel and I'm going to select look through selected. And that's going to put me at the inside of the camera. Now I'm seeing what the camera sees. And I'm just using my standard movement tools to move around to get this camera positioned. You can see right here it says camera 1. And I want to get this in a position where I can see the pose. And once I've got that in place, I'm going to come over here and I'm going to grab Translate, Rotate, Scale, highlight all those, right click, and hit Lock Selected. So now, when I'm in the camera view, I can't move this at all. Whenever we're animating a linear shot like this, we want to make sure that we're animating the camera. We want to pose our character so that he, she, or it reads in the camera view. If we go 7 here, I just hit 7 on the keyboard. This turns into a silhouette. What we're interested in is a nice clean silhouette so that everything reads pretty well. We got a little bit of negative space here in the arm, which defines the arm. We can see the fingers outside of the leg. We've got a nice negative space here. Everything looks pretty good. So that's a pretty good pose. Now we're going to do our next pose where he's going to be looking at a watch. What we'll want to do, we're not interested in timing at this point. How quickly he brings his arm up and looks at his watch is not a concern at this moment. What we're concerned about is getting the poses correct. So what we want to do is we want to just put in some space between each of these poses so that we can see whether or not they're reading well. And usually a good distance between poses is about 10 frames. So I'm going to come out here to frame 10, and I'm going to grab his arm and bring it up and bring it in. And again, I've got auto key on, so that should set a key for us. You can see that his arm's coming up from the original pose to this pose. And we'll bring his wrist in. And usually when you look at a wristwatch, you kind of bend your wrist down a little bit. So we might want to even bring this down, right? And we're in the camera view. So we can't really move around and see how this arm is. And we could switch back and forth from the camera view to perspective view, and that would work just fine. A better way to go, though, is to pick a 2-window view like this one, for example. I'm just going to click on this, and this is going to give us the perspective view, which will allow us to move around, and then under Panels, Perspective, we're going to pick Camera 1 and shade that. So now we can see what's happening over here in our camera view and still move around and see if we've got things the way that we want them. So I'm going to bring his elbow in just a little bit more. I'm going to turn his wrist a little. And I'll probably even grab his fingers at this point. And this is probably a little more detail than I intended to do, but this is the part of the class that I like the most because I came up as an animator. So this is fun for me. So I'm sorry, you'll have to watch me animate for a few minutes. So I'm going to bring his fingers in, make like a little fist with his fingers. Normally I just, and probably did this in class, I usually just deal with a few of the controls, but since we're putting this on video and it's a shorter version, I'll indulge myself a little bit. There we go. So that looks pretty good. We can see, I can move stuff in this view and we'll see it change over here as well. So it's not really reading. I'll bring that out like that. And now what we want to do is we don't want things to just stay still from one pose to the next. We're going to want to address all of our character. We want to make sure that he feels like a living thing, like a living individual. So even though this arm really isn't doing very much, I'm going to reposition it just to give it some life. And then I need to grab his neck, bring his neck down a little bit, grab his head, bring his head down a little bit so he's kind of looking at his watch, and then we'll tilt him to the side a little bit just to keep it interesting. We could do something like this. We can maybe, because he's looking at this wrist, maybe what we'll do is we'll shift his weight a little to the other side. A little bit more bend in the knees, perhaps. Maybe even a little, just one of these back sequences, one of these back controls here. We'll grab that. We'll bring him forward just a little bit so that he can be looking at his watch. And these are not necessarily, you know, these are not the poses necessarily. There are all kinds of, you know, you can make all sorts of decisions about how you want to do this. If you wanted to, you know, wanted him to be really anxious, maybe he brings his arm out to the side as he's looking at his watch. You could do a lot of things. There are no right and wrong. There's only right and wrong for the story that you're trying to tell. So we've got our first pose, and now we've got our second pose. And then we're going to have him look for the bus. Here's where the pop through part comes through. If we look at look in the camera view. If we scrub the timeline here, we can see that he's moving. And if we were to play this back, we really wouldn't see the poses in a strong way because they're transitioning quickly through each of those poses. So what we need to do is we need to set up our timeline here so that we're holding on a pose and then we switch immediately to another pose. And fortunately, there's a really cool way to do that now. We used to have to do it with the tangents, but now we can just do it right here on the timeline. I'm going to right click, and there's an item here called Enable Stepped Preview. And if I let go on that, now anywhere from 1 to 9, he stays in his original pose. And as soon as I go to frame 10, he pops into that next pose. That's why we call it a pop through, because it pops through the poses. So we'll go to frame 20 to do our next pose. I'm going to use a technique here that is very, very useful in animation. It's called a reverse. And I'm going to reverse his spine. I'm going to get his spine going the other direction. And I'm going to tilt his pelvis the other way as well. And then I'm going to bring this forward. Again, we want to keep his weight over his feet. We don't want him leaning too far back or he'll fall over. And then what I'm going to do is I'm going to take this arm, bring this arm out, bring this elbow out, get that wrist up. Again, I'm looking at it over here in the camera view to make sure that everything looks the way that I want it to. I'm going to bring this out and back, bring it down, maybe out to the side a little bit. And with the fingers, I'm going to knock this out really quick on the fingers here. I'm just going to highlight all of them at once. There we go. No, I can't do that. I just realized I can't do that because there's values here that, whoops. There's values here that I haven't done anything with, so it will mess with my posing. So I'm going to bring that finger out now because I want him to bring his fingers up. We're going to have his hand come out of that fist shape and down and out into having his fingers out and spread a little bit. I'm not going to bother with the spread for the demo here, but normally what I would do is just spread the fingers out a little bit. Okay. I keep missing. Sorry about that. There we go. There we go. All right, there's that. All right. Now what I want to do, because he's going to be looking down the street for the bus, I'm going to turn his torso just a little bit. Start with the bottom one and bring this like that. Bring this one like that. You can see the arms are staying behind because I haven't moved those yet. And we'll bring this arm up a little and bring the lower arm down. And I'm going to take this wrist and roll it like that. And then bring it up. And since he's looking for the bus and it's going to be down this way, looking down the street this direction, I'm going to shift his weight back again. So lean him over this way. So all these little changes that we're making keep the animation looking interesting. The more you do to break up the previous pose, the more interesting the animation is to watch. So since we tilted his head the other way last time, this time we'll give it a tilt like this. We might be bending him just a little too much. Actually, what I'm going to do is I'm going to take this bottom piece here, this bottom control, and I'm going to roll him forward like that. Again, we're still going to keep him over his feet. And we may even want to take this foot and just rotate it a little bit just to show that he's now leaning that direction. And Let's get his head's not quite working right. There we go. Let's ignore the eyes for the moment. He's gone all zombie-eyed on us. That's because he's got an eye target. There's a target where his eyes are going to look, and right now that target is floating out away from his head. So we'll fix that later. We'll turn him a little more that way, and then we'll tilt his head a little bit this direction. And let's see. I'll bring that arm down a little, and I'm going to rotate it a little bit like that, maybe. No, I don't like that. So we'll undo that. Let's try this. Put this back like that. Like that. So I'm using my thumbnails, and I'm refining the poses as I go. So there we are. So there's our third pose where he's looking down the street towards the bus. So we've got pose 1, he's just kind of standing there. Pose 2, where he's looking at his watch. And you can see the shift between those two. Oops, let's get over here in the camera view. You can see the shift between those two, the weight shift forward, the back change, the head move, all of that stuff. And then we scrub down here until we get to frame 20, and we pop over to there. I'm going to turn off the controls real quick. Makes it a little easier to see. So there he stands. He looks at his watch, and then he looks down the street to see if the bus is coming. You get that little shift in the foot. We'd have to, when we're cleaning this up, when we talk about this next week, we'd have to lift that foot and place it down. But now what we can do is we can actually hit play and see what our poses look like. We can see whether they're reading, whether they're telling the story we want them to tell. So that's how a pop through is done. You're basically just posing your character in the main poses, the storytelling poses that you've created in your thumbnails, about 10 frames apart. You can do 5 frames if you like. It's usually a good idea to have some number of frames between each main pose, each storytelling pose. We also call them golden poses. It's a good idea to have some space between those so that you can see each pose as it plays. So this week, your goal is to put together your pop-throughs, get those up and running so you can see whether your shot looks the way you expect it to. And then next week, we'll talk about adding in breakdowns, the transitional poses that you'll need, and going into splines, adding holds and breakdowns so that your character can stay in a pose so that it reads and then transition nicely into the next pose. Let me know if you have any questions. Drop me an email, give me a call, and have fun. This is the fun part for me, anyway. This is the best part of animating. So have a ball with it.